Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to give folks just a minute or two to trickle in, and then we'll get started. For folks who are just joining us, welcome. Thank you for joining How to Approach, Plan, and Deliver an Effective MVP. We're going to give folks just one more minute to trickle in, and then we will get started. Thanks for your patience. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's VIGIT webinar. This webinar is titled How to Approach, Plan, and Deliver an Effective MVP. My name is Addison Delancey, and I'm a digital strategist at VIGIT. Thank you so much for joining today. Before Claire gets started, I'm going to share just a few words. First, a bit about VIGIT. We are a digital innovation agency with offices in the Washington, D.C. metro area, Durham, North Carolina, Boulder, Colorado, and Chattanooga, Tennessee. For more than 20 years, we've worked with startups, nonprofits, and organizations alike to help brand design and build digital products and experiences. For many of our clients, including Optify, Grub Market, Nest Realty, and MaterialWise, this work also included helping to plan and deliver effective MVPs. Claire will share a bit more on this in just a few minutes, but before she does, just a few logistical notes. This is a 45-minute webinar, and we'll do a Q&A at the end for an additional 10 minutes. Feel free to drop questions into the Q&A box in Zoom, and we'll keep track of those throughout the webinar. Claire will be sharing some resources throughout the webinar, and I'll be dropping those links to each of the resources in the chat toward the end of the session, and we'll also be following up with those over email later today. There will also be a recording and copy of the presentation made available for attendees, which we'll share in the next couple of days. All right, let's go ahead and get started.
All right, thanks so much, Addison. And thanks everybody for joining today. So I'm going to start off by quickly introducing myself. My name is Claire Atwell-Eisinger, and I've been at VIGIT for a little over 7 years. I started out as a digital project manager and pretty quickly gravitated towards specializing in some of our custom software development projects. And some of the unique challenges that came up on those software projects drove us to formalize a product management team a few years ago. And that team focuses on helping businesses and organizations build and launch new digital products. So today I'm going to share some of our lessons learned from navigating those challenges that will help you think about how to plan, approach, and deliver an effective MVP. So I'm going to cover 4 main topics today. The first is approach, so how your organization should be thinking about an MVP development effort. Planning, what questions your organization should be able to answer before you get started. Scope, so how to think about determining what to build. And then finally, I'll talk through some best practices and considerations for the build and launch phase. Since this is a pretty big topic and we only have about 40 minutes today before we open it up for questions, my goal is definitely not to cover absolutely everything, but instead to introduce some concepts at a high level and then share resources from thought leaders in the industries in the industry on some specific concepts along the way, many of which have informed the content in this webinar. All right, with that said, let's get started. So we're going to start off with approach. So what is an MVP and how does it fit into a broader strategy for effective product development? You've probably heard that an MVP is your minimum viable product. And while that's true, I think that framing sometimes leads business leaders to see an MVP as simply the end version of your product with only half of your planned features. So for the purpose of this talk, I'd like to reframe an MVP as more of a process, not a product. And it is in fact just the first step in a process. It's the first opportunity you have to get software in the hands of end users. In other words, going from 0 to 1, where 0 is users don't have access to this tool, and 1 is users get to try out the tool for the first time and let us know what they think. And this is, of course, a super exciting time. The first release of your software can make a huge impact on your end users. It can also be the foundation for a successful long-term business or a demonstration to investors or partners that your business idea is viable. However, I have some bad news. It is an unfortunate but well-known reality that the overwhelming majority of new digital product efforts fail. Some products never see the light of day, and the ones that do rarely have the impact or user adoption we hope for. At the heart of those failures is one universal truth. When you build a product, you have to make a lot of assumptions. And because there are so many assumptions you have to make, no matter how good you are, some of those assumptions are going to be wrong. But before we talk about how to prevent that tower of assumptions from taking your product, let's see what it looks like to get it right. For software to be successful, it has to deliver in three key areas: purpose, value, and quality. So what do we mean by purpose? Successful software addresses real user needs and solves real user problems. The first big assumption that product teams make is that they're building something people actually want. In a postmortem of more than 200 startups, CB Insights found that the #1 cause of failure was no market need. Those startups spent months or even years building a product before they found out that their target audience just weren't interested in their product. So purpose leads us as product professionals to ask, are we building the right thing? And this is true for big organizations building an internal tool for their employees, just like it is for startups. But identifying a problem that actually needs solving is just the first hurdle. The next one is value. Successful software creates value for end users in a way that creates value for the business. So to build successful software, not only do we have to build the right thing, but we have to build the thing right. If our solution ideas aren't usable or don't drive value for the business, the product won't be successful. And our final pillar is quality. Software can only be successful if it is made to last. In other words, if it's easy to maintain and change. The beauty of software is that it's much more malleable than anything we build in the real world, which is a good thing because quality software can be adapted to suit changes without significant cost. Whether those come up during initial development, which they will, or if some of your initial assumptions weren't correct, which they won't all be, or because delivering purpose and value will require changes in the weeks or months or years after your first release. So if this is what we hope to accomplish with the product effort, that begs the question, how do we get there? I want to briefly talk through 4 principles of successful software development that will help put you on the right path, and we'll see these repeated throughout this webinar. The first is continuous discovery. Continuous discovery starts with the acknowledgement that we don't know everything. So we embrace a mindset of learning fast, building fast, then testing and measuring. The next is user-centered design, which encourages us to keep the focus on the end user, solving their problems and designing interfaces that they actually want to use. The third is agile development, an iterative approach to planning and delivering software through the collaborative efforts of a self-organizing cross-functional team. And the final one is minimizing complexity. Complexity in code is anything that makes it difficult, risky, or costly to iterate on and improve your product. Complexity is inevitable because the human ideas and real-world concepts that get reflected in software are complicated. So the goal is not to prevent complexity, but just to minimize it. The backbone of all of these principles is an iterative process where we acknowledge that we will be making assumptions. We do everything we can to inform those assumptions so they're not just wild guesses. And we work quickly as a team to deliver working software to users so those assumptions can be tested. With that in mind, your first release is just the first step in that iterative process. So what makes an effective MVP? An effective MVP delivers value to users by providing the simplest solutions to their highest priority problems as quickly as possible, gives the creators of those solutions an opportunity to test those assumptions, and either iterate on the things we got wrong or focus future efforts on improving the things we got right. And I'll stop here and say that it's really critical that everyone in your organization who's involved in product development buys into these being the goals of your first release. The truth is that everything we do is a guess until working software gets in the hands of users. And starting from a long list of requirements or feature ideas and working down that list until you finish, which you probably never will, or until you hit a deadline, will not lead to quality, purposeful, valuable software. Take a sip of water. So now that we're all on the same page about what about what an MVP is and how it contributes to long-term product success, let's dive into what an organization should be considering before embarking on an MVP development project. I want to broach this topic by thinking about the questions that your organization needs to be able to answer before you get started, and then how you can go about answering them. Before getting started, your organization will need to be able to articulate what problems are we solving and for whom, why are we solving them, what's in it for us, who's responsible for solving them, when will they be delivered, and then how will solutions get into the hands of our users. This isn't a to-do list that you can check off in sequential order. There are considerations within each of these questions that factor into decisions that you'll need to make in each of the other ones. So let's talk about them. We'll start off with problem discovery. What problems are we solving and for whom? The New York Times interviewed one of the founders of Waze this week, who just came out with a new book called Falling in Love with the Problem, Not the Solution. The article quotes him as saying, "If I say I'm building an AI crowdsourced navigation system, you don't really care. But if I tell you I'm going to help you avoid traffic jams, you do care. But before you fall in love with the problem, you need to understand it. And that's what discovery is all about." The goals of discovery are understanding users and their context, identifying problems and opportunities, and establishing a shared vision with stakeholders about the problems we're trying to solve. We recommend taking a lean approach to upfront discovery. The goal here is not to predict everything that users may ever want, it's to learn just enough to get started. In a very simplified way, problem discovery can be thought of as activities and outputs. So some example activities that might help you in your information gathering are: first, exploratory research, where you dig into subject matter and context, do some competitive review and analysis, and figure out who your users are. Next, you'll want to think about conducting user or stakeholder interviews. In other words, just talk to real people. This doesn't need to be a months-long research project. A few casual conversations with a representative sample of your prospective users can be a great place to start. You can ask broad questions about how they currently complete a task, and then dig in on what issues they face with their current tools or process. Finally, conducting workshops with internal folks in your business is a great way to coalesce and synthesize information you've gathered and get everybody excited about the problems you'll be solving. After the information gathering phase, you'll want to turn to outputs, where you document your findings. Outputs are going to vary pretty widely based on your organization and what you're trying to solve, but some potential outputs you might see are: first, target audience definition, which could look like user personas or user journey maps. This may be hard to see on the screen, but this is an example of a user story map that user journey map that we created with Nest Realty as we worked on their transaction management tool for home buying and selling, Envoy. So for this tool, we looked at the process that real estate agents go through when selling a home, and then what that process looks like from the client side. You can also think about coming up with a product vision statement, which describes the overarching long-term mission of your product. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, you want to get a set of prioritized user problems that we want to try to solve with this first release. If you're talking to real users, you'll probably have hundreds of potential problems you could solve. And there are a number of ways to think about how to prioritize that problem list down to just the most critical ones. So here's some things you can be thinking about. First, you can prioritize problems by thinking about which are your riskiest assumptions. What's going to be most important to validate before you go much further? I will say that if your riskiest assumptions are around whether this is a problem that needs to be solved, you might want to consider a lighter weight proof of concept or functional prototype to test this before investing in the first release of a long-term product. Other things you can think about in terms of prioritizing problems are suitability. What problems are our organization most uniquely suited to solve? Frequency, so how often do these come up? And then urgency and impact. How soon do users need the solution and how big of a difference is it going to make? Another thing that needs to be figured out early on is, why are we solving these problems? What value is the business getting out of this? And how will we know it was worth the effort and investment? What's in it for us? Defining measurable outcomes up front has a number of benefits. First, this gives product leaders an opportunity to align with business stakeholders on what the impact this investment will have on the business's bottom line. Second, we know upfront how we'll know if we were successful, and most importantly, how we'll measure that success. And finally, the team will use those underlying business objectives to inform product decisions down the road. We recommend using a goal-setting framework to articulate these desired business outcomes, like the OKR framework, which stands for Objective and Key Results. An objective is a significant, concrete, clearly defined goal. And alongside with an objective, we have a few key results, which are measurable success, which are success metrics that are used to track achievement of that goal. So your objective should be qualitative and your key results need to be quantitative and measurable. Key results should also be a measure of business results, not output or tasks. So you want to avoid a key result that's tied to product analytics, like users will complete 4 transactions in the system within the first month, and think instead about how we'll measure the business impact of those tasks. Let's take a look at an example. Again, this is with Nest Realty, who we worked with a few years ago. So one of the key motivators for Nest to build a client-facing platform where they could keep better track of a real estate transaction was so that their clients were more informed about the transaction process. So once they understand what the objective is, they need to figure out how they're going to measure this. So they might say that at least 70% of clients self-report being satisfied or very satisfied with the amount of information they received. Or they may also track how many questions agents get from clients about this kind of information and expect to see that go down. When you're thinking about coming up with quantitative key results, there are a few things to think about. The first is that you need to know what your baseline is. And if you don't have one, you should probably start tracking it now. And another thing we would want to see here is a time horizon. So we would want to know that at least 70% of clients would self-report this some number of weeks or months after the product launches. Next, we're going to talk about identifying the team. One of the 10 principles of the Agile Development methodology is that the work is done by a self-organizing, cross-functional, independent team, meaning everyone needed to solve the problem is engaged in the problem solving. So understanding who you need on your team up front is a helpful way to first identify any gaps, whether that's in knowledge or skill set that we need to fill for this team to be able to solve these problems independently. This will also help you set expectations for involvement, which may mean shifting other projects away from folks who need dedicated time to work on this effort. And finally, this will help you plan for successful collaboration between team members, which we'll talk about more in the build and launch section. The core roles that you need to be considering for a delivery team are, first and foremost, the product owner. This person is ultimately responsible for decisions about what we're building and how we're building it. They will be responsible for liaising with subject matter experts and business stakeholders who likely won't be part of this core team, but who will need to be engaged throughout the project. If you're planning to work with an agency partner to help your organization build and launch a product, my #1 recommendation is that product ownership should stay within your organization so that someone at your organization has a really good understanding of what we're building. Second, you need a team of engineers to build the software. Solving large-scale practical problems with technology at the speed we're talking about typically requires more than one engineer on your team. Engineers have different skill sets and specializations, and a team of devs can share context, distribute the workload, and work together on hard problems. You'll also need a product or user experience designer who's thinking about the front-end user experience of the software and supporting with decisions about how solution ideas should actually work. And finally, you'll need a delivery manager. This is the glue person who's keeping the team together, writing tickets, tasking engineers, and managing multiple streams of communication. At Viget, our product managers serve as delivery managers on our MVP project teams. Product owners with a more technical background can definitely serve as delivery managers, and this works really well for a team of 3 or 4 people, but on a larger team, that person can quickly become a bottleneck. Next, I want to talk about timeline. When will these solutions be delivered to users? In other words, how much time should we invest in the first release? It is notoriously difficult to estimate level of effort for large-scale software development projects. If you ask an engineer to estimate how long it will take to implement a detailed set of requirements, you'll probably hear, well, it takes as long as it takes. But remember, at this point, we don't have detailed requirements. We just have problems. And having some frame of reference for when we want to deliver solutions to these problems is a really helpful way to, first, constrain your solution ideas. What can we do in the time we have? And focus on what's just now possible. Having some sense of timeline will also help your organization understand its investment. If you're working with an agency partner or outside vendor to build this product, you'll likely be paying for their time versus paying a fixed cost for some predetermined scope or output. And finally, a deadline is a really useful tool to rally the team around. Without a deadline, things can frankly end up taking forever, and you might find yourself funding a Godzilla, which is an analogy that our friends at DevBridge made in a talk from way back in 2019 that has really stuck with me. With no deadline, as time goes on and business services and expectations change, complexity grows, and the likelihood of your team getting something out the door drops considerably. In practice, there are really no hard and fast rules about how much time you should spend on your first release, because whatever it is you're hoping to validate and how much needs to be in your product to validate it is going to be specific to your organization and the problems you're trying to solve. But here are some general guidelines and things to consider. First and foremost, you want to deliver value quickly. If your team is planning to work for 6 months or longer before software ever sees the light of day, that's probably too long. Another consideration is budget, particularly if you're working with an outside partner. Since this release is just the first step in a long running process, you don't want to spend all the money you've budgeted for this product on the first release. We recommend spending no more than 60% of the budget that you've allocated for the first year of this product to get you to that first release. The next thing you want to consider is really embracing the constraint. Business leaders sometimes go into product development efforts assuming that people will get frustrated using something that's half finished. But the beauty of a time constraint is that it encourages your team to finish something and get it out by the deadline. And that's why it's important that the deadline is real. This shouldn't just be an internal milestone that everyone can wave at as it goes by on the calendar. You should tie this to some plan to bring charter users into the app. And that brings us to our final consideration, access. How will solutions actually get into the hands of users? I want to think of this in 3 parts. The first is technical. Based on what we know about our users in the industry, what technologies are going to be required to get this software into the hands of users? Perhaps employees will need to be on a VPN on your network to use the tool, or maybe this product needs to access customer data stored in your CRM like Salesforce, or maybe this tool needs to be accessed offline. These immutable technical requirements will impact not just your timeline, but also making sure that you have everybody on the team that you need to solve these problems. The next is delivery. So who are our charter users and how are they going to get access to this tool? There's a great quote I love from Marty Kagan's book, Inspired, that says, if you find you're having trouble recruiting charter users, then it's very likely that you are chasing a problem that isn't that important and you'll probably have a hard time selling it. This is one of the very first reality checks to make sure you are spending your time on something worthwhile. And this is also a chance to get creative. Perhaps we pay users to join us in a pilot, or we release a beta to friends and family, or maybe we ask a subset of our employees to complete just one of their daily tasks in this new software before we migrate everyone to a new system. The final consideration for access is testing. How are we planning to validate our assumptions and measure our success? You don't need a day-by-day implementation timeline of a testing plan outline before you start building software, but you should have some idea of how you're going to get input, whether that's through surveys or pilot groups, or follow-up conversations with users. It's really important that you have some sense of how assumptions are going to get validated before you get started. So once your organization is able to answer all those questions, now what? This information should be the foundation of a product brief that can get shared with everyone on the team and bring everybody up to the same baseline level of understanding of what we're doing and why. If you are looking to hire an agency partner to help support this effort, the answers to these questions should really be the backbone of your RFP. And this is the kind of information that we typically ask of clients who come to us with new ideas. I'm going to take another sip of water. So next we want to talk about defining scope. This is where those prioritized problems turn into solution ideas and we figure out what we're going to build first. Now, the goal here is definitely not to try to come up with 100 features and then organize them into 2-week sprints for the next 20 weeks. Instead, our goals here are first to, over the long term, create a shared understanding of where we want to go, which is based on what we know now, which we all acknowledge is limited and will change once we get started. Second, based on where we want to go, we need to achieve some consensus on what's most important for our first release. And then in the immediate term, we want to plan our initial work with just a bit more fidelity, just enough so that the team knows where to get started and what to work on. So I'm going to talk through a strategy that we use at Bigot for scope definition, which is a modified version of the user story mapping exercise that Jeff Patton outlines in his book by the same name. User story mapping is a great tool for teams to think about what we're going to build, starting in really broad strokes, and then drilling down with increasing levels of detail. I'm going to start by giving just a brief primer of what a user story map actually looks like, and then we'll talk through each step. So at the top here, you can see that we have activities. These are the core functionalities of the app. In this example, this app lets users organize and manage email, and then manage their calendar and contacts. Within each activity, we have stories. So these are what users need to do as part of this activity and why they need to do it. Then each story is broken down further into specific tasks, and those tasks are organized into slices, which helps team visualize how those stories will get accomplished iteratively. So what we need to do first, and then how we will iterate on each of those stories to provide increasing value to users. Jeff Patton recommends doing this entire exercise collaboratively. Personally, I found that it's helpful for a product owner or product manager to do a little bit of upfront work to get the team started, and we'll talk about what that looks like. I'm going to use two examples today for demonstration purposes. The first is a real world, not product example, telling a story about your morning routine. And the second is a very much real world example, Airbnb, although you'll have to do a little bit of suspension of disbelief and think back to what Airbnb might have looked like at the very beginning. Okay, so to start out, we need to identify the key activities that users will need to perform to address our prioritized problems. You should constrain this to no more than 3 sentences. This isn't a marketing pitch or an opportunity to sell someone on the problem. This is the cut and dry 1 to 3 sentence, not super sexy description of what users literally need to do in this application. So as an easy example, let's start off with your morning routine. I want to give everybody a second. And if I asked you to tell me a story about your morning routine in 1 sentence, what might be in that sentence? Give everyone a second to think about it. So you might come up with something like, well, in the morning, I get out of bed, I do my morning chores, I get the kids ready for school, and I get myself ready for work. With just 1 sentence, you're not going to be able to get into the specific details about what goes into each of these tasks. For example, we might say that to get myself ready for work, I brush my teeth, take a shower, get dressed. We're really not thinking at that level yet. We're just thinking of the basic key activities. Now let's look at Airbnb. At its very simplest, the most basic description of the key activities in Airbnb might look something like this. Homeowners can list their properties for short rentals. Renters can find and book properties. Renters and homeowners can exchange information before and during the renter's stay. So now that you have your key activities, we need to write user stories for each activity. So what are the individual user actions that make up each of those activity buckets? In terms of process, I typically recommend that the product owner or product manager takes a first stab at this so the team has something to react to when they start collaborating. But as the team starts working on this together, you will almost certainly find yourself rewriting or reorganizing these, and that's totally okay. So first, what is a user story? A user story has 4 key parts. First, we have a user, and at this stage, we should be thinking of the real live human being, not a role or a user type in the application. And then we have some action they need to perform. And this should be agnostic of design or implementation. So we would never have a user story that's like, as a user, I can click a button. The next 2 parts deal with why the user needs to be able to perform this action. We need to know what the desired outcome of that action is, and then what benefit is coming from that outcome, why that end result is important. So let's think back to our morning routine example. One of our activity buckets was do morning chores. And let's say one of the actions within my morning chores is taking my dog Scruffy for a walk. That's simple enough. As a user, I need to take Scruffy for a walk. So then we want to say, why do I take Scruffy for a walk and why is that important? So why do I walk Scruffy? Well, Scruffy needs to have a chance to go potty and Scruffy needs to get some exercise. But why is that important? Well, if I don't give Scruffy a chance to use the bathroom, he'll pee on the floor and that's no good. And if Scruffy doesn't get some exercise, he might get bored and go through a tear through the house and that's not good either. So you'll want to do this for each story that you can think of within each bucket. And as a product owner, you will have that deep understanding of users to inform these outcomes and benefits based on the problems we're trying to solve with this application. So again, very limited example, but we might say some of the stories within our do morning chores activities are I take Scruffy for a walk, maybe I clean up the kitchen, and I pack lunches for my family. Now we're going to do the same thing for Airbnb. So one of the activities we talked about for Airbnb was that homeowners can list properties for short rentals. So one user story we might come up with within that list properties activity is, as a homeowner, I can create a listing for my rental. I can get my listing into the system. And we can think about some outcomes there. So renters can see if my property fits their needs, or renters are excited about my property. But then we would want to ask why. And these are maybe not the best examples, but renters can see if my property fits their needs. So they'll know whether they want to book it, or maybe they'll be able to tell it doesn't fit their needs. And renters are excited about my property. This is important to me because I want people to book my property because I want to make some money. So again, we might think of some stories that tie back to this activity. This is probably a limited set just for the purposes of demonstration, but some of those stories might be creating a property listing and then being able to manage the rate, so how much I charge, and then availability, so that no one comes to book my property on a weekend that my grandparents are in town. Now that we have stories in our activity buckets, this is where the fun starts. We're going to start thinking about specific solution or implementation ideas that will allow users to do the things they need to do and get the benefits they need. And we're also going to start thinking about what the bare minimum of each of those solution ideas might be that still deliver that value. So again, we're looking at our morning routine example. Let's think about, what does it actually look like to take Scruffy for a walk? And we're going to start with just the typical average morning. So let's say that on most days, I walk Scruffy around the block. At this point, we don't need to know turn-by-turn directions of my route or how many poop bags are required. We just kind of want to get some sense collaboratively as a team for what the user story takes Scruffy for a walk actually looks like from a task perspective. But now I want you to imagine that you've overslept, you slept through your alarm, your whole family is running late, the house is in chaos, and the family only has 10 minutes to get out the door. So can we think of a creative solution that delivers on the outcomes and benefits we need, no dog pee on the floor, and Scruffy doesn't eat my shoes, that could happen in the least amount of time possible? Perhaps we just let Scruffy out in the backyard. He can do his business, he can get some exercise. It's maybe not Scruffy's best day ever, but it could work in a pinch. And based on this, our original user story might be a little too prescriptive. So we might rewrite it to say, instead of taking Scruffy for a walk, the user story here is taking Scruffy outside. And you can imagine that we can then do this for all our other user stories, thinking through what a typical morning might look like, and then deciding what we could live with if the whole family was in chaos. So instead of packing lunches for everyone, which we would do on a typical morning, we might say, well, I really just need to make sure that my family eats something, and I can give everybody lunch money and then they can eat lunch. This is obviously going to depend on your family and your priorities and what your underlying outcomes and benefits are of the things you do in your morning routine. No judgment here if you say that you don't need to brush your teeth if you woke up late, but my woke up late slice would probably still have teeth brushing in it. Okay, so now let's look at our Airbnb example one more time. We've talked about these stories. Users can create property listings and manage rate and availability. Let's say to achieve the outcomes we've agreed on for creating a property listing, we decide that homeowners need to be able to define search criteria, like the location of this property and the number of guests that can stay there. Let's say that they need to add any limitations, like no pets or no kids. They need to add a description and they need to add photos. But what would it look like if we were just going to see this work? We don't necessarily need to see the best version of each of these tasks, but we just want to literally know what it would look like to see it work, to have a property listing in the application. So we're going to think about, of the tasks that we've talked about, what is in our see it work version, and what can we save to make it just a little bit better? What could we live with if we had even less time than we do to make this application. Perhaps homeowners could put some of those limitations like no pets or no kids in the description. It's not great, but it does give them an avenue to communicate that. And photos, while nice, aren't necessarily required to see it work. And let's say as the team's talking about photos, we might come up with a ton of ideas for how photos could work. Maybe we want to let users determine which is the featured photo or add captions to photos. Based on that conversation, the team might decide that photos deserve its own stories. So we would write a user action, then outcomes and benefits for that story, and then we would organize the tasks, perhaps just in the make it better phase. So you would be working collaboratively with a team over what could be 10s or 20s or 50 user stories and thinking through what these tasks are and focusing really specifically on what we could live with if we just needed to see it work. And then pretty much everything else is going to be things that we could do to make it better. You're going to end with something that's massive and looks something like this, where we've mapped stories for each of our core activities and determined tasks for each stories. In terms of the process, the team will then focus on the see it work version, which you can think of like the MVP of your MVP before you move on to any of the make it better ideas. The benefit of this approach is that if things take a little longer than planned, this team will still likely be on track to release a working, if maybe not perfect, version of everything versus working down this list in order and having 7 of the 9 features that you wanted, but not having any way to address some of those core problems that you identified. One quick thing I want to point out is that you can't forget about your support tasks. So these are features that don't directly contribute to your product's value, but are required for users to access the solutions you're building. So these are going to be features like admin management, user onboarding, logging in and out. You can see an example here of the see it work slice for user onboarding. So this team decided that for this version, users would be getting into the app only through invitations, either from members or admins, and that they would save users applying to join this platform and admins viewing and approving those applications for a later version. So the last bit here, now that you have all of your stories identified and your tasks laid out, is to dig in a little deeper on your see it work phase so the team can start planning the first few sprints. Anything that's not in the see it work phase, you really don't need to worry too much about right now. It's helpful that the team has the whole picture in mind, but I guarantee that as you're working through your see it work phase, things are going to become more or less important to the product, and that you'll be able to prioritize as you go. So a few things to think about for this see it work phase is that the team should try to commit to spending no more than 60% of your timeline in implementing this very first version of the app. So for a 20-week project, we want to get here by no later than the end of the 12th week. And so with this in mind, the team may want to move things in or out based on just a gut reaction of whether this seems like a reasonable goal for that period of time. And again, we have some buffer because if things do take longer than expected, we aren't targeting our deadline for this, but really just the 60% mark in our timeline. Then the team will want to start digging in on more specific requirements. You'll be looking for any areas of technical risk, and you'll start thinking about how to sequence this work. Because everything is equal priority, we don't have to think, at least in the early stages, about what's more important than anything else, because we all agreed that this is the bare bones minimum woke up late version of our app. Once you have the team in agreement on this, that's pretty much everything the team that needs to get started. And now you're off to the races. To help you prepare for the build and launch phase, I want to focus on how the product owner of your organization can support some of those core principles of successful software development that we talked about in the beginning. And those are continuous discovery, agile development, user-centered design, and minimizing complexity. So we're starting with continuous discovery. It can be tempting to think of discovery as something that happens only in a siloed upfront phase. As a product owner, there are a number of ways that you can continue to champion this discovery mindset throughout the process. First is engaging with subject matter experts. Subject matter experts should be proxies for your users, and they should be engaged in the project. They should provide input on early requirements, weigh in on quick decisions for feature definition, And they should themselves be early users of early versions of the software way before it sees the light of day. But even before a subject matter expert starts clicking around, as a product owner, you should be user number one. If the team is following an iterative approach, working software should be deployed to a testing environment within the first few weeks. Don't wait until the end of the see it work phase to start actually using the product. With the deep understanding of your users that you're bringing to this team, you'll start to see areas of improvement and think of new ideas based on what you're seeing as you're using the product and trying to accomplish these tasks. And of course, those new ideas will need to be prioritized. As you're nearing the end of the see it work phase, you're likely to have a long list of potential things that could be worked on with the team's remaining time. If you have a way to get input from real users at that point, great. But if not, you should prioritize based on your initial desired outcomes. Don't worry too much about enhancing support features like reset password or tasks that only a few users will need to complete, like admin management. Finally, as your launch date is drawing closer, I can't stress enough, it's really critical that you firm up your plan to test your assumptions, measure your outcomes, and have that knowledge feed back into your delivery team. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, sometimes hour-by-hour excitement of feature development, but don't lose sight of the underlying purpose of this first release. It's to make all the subsequent ones better. Next, we're going to talk about Agile development, which has actually less to do with the actual mechanics of writing code and more to do with everything that supports engineers in having them do their best work. So the first is iterative planning. Like I mentioned earlier, the benefit of starting with a see it work phase is that every feature is equal priority, which gives the team flexibility to plan and sequence work based on what will be most efficient. Trust your team to make these decisions about order of operations for early work. And as you move past the see it work phase and start thinking through enhancements, remember that you'll typically be planning no more than a sprint or two in advance. The next piece of Agile development is iterative design and definition. The waterfall method of designing everything up front rarely works for software because it's impossible to visualize all the complexity well enough up front to understand all the implications in a design before building anything. As a result, any initial designs or feature definition will have problems that won't become apparent until implementation is well underway. Design and definition needs to be a continuous process that spans the entire lifecycle of the project, and your product designer should be dedicated to this project for the whole time. For this continuous process to work, collaboration is key. As a product owner, you can work with a delivery manager to help define tools and process collaboration up front, and then make time throughout the project to reflect on what's working and where the team can improve. Just some examples, at Vigit, we use Slack for asynchronous communication, relaying quick questions and information back and forth, typically hundreds of times a day. And then the full team will meet several times a week for stand-ups, where we all get together and discuss what everyone's working on and any blockers that folks are facing. Even with all these means of communication, it is not feasible for every person on the team to get approval for every micro decision that's made along the way. So as a product owner, you can empower your team to make decisions based on their professional expertise and their understanding of the problem space. The next principle I want to discuss is user-centered design and how your team can embrace this principle while you're creating the first version of your product. First and foremost, it's important to see designers as user advocates who are thinking about how to make a kick-ass product that end users will love. This can be tricky to reason about in really early development because the engineers are thinking about the simplest implementation for each solution, whereas the designer will want to be thinking beyond that. I can say from experience that it's much easier to scale back a make it better design to use for a see it work ticket for engineers than it is to try to constrain designers to just designing see it work interfaces and then trying to cobble together new functionality into that design. And another benefit of having designers think a little ahead to that make it better milestone is that designers may have their own new solution ideas that we can prioritize among some of the other things we planned up front. And that's great too. So how do you manage that? I'd like to recommend considering designs as artifacts of understanding, not final deliverables. Artifacts help everyone on the team get on the same page about what we're building, but ultimately, we've all agreed that value is delivered to end users with working software, not Figma files. Give product designers space to work at whatever level of fidelity is most appropriate for the problem they're solving. Support features and simple form pages can often be illustrated with a wireframe or a sketch. And avoid the notion of design approvals. Like I mentioned earlier, it's unlikely we'll be able to think through every possible edge case or state in design. The goal is really to get far enough for engineers to get started and then work together to arrive at the final solution in the product. Next, it's important to have a process in place to manage some of these assumptions. Interface designs are essentially the top tier of our assumption cake, and they're built on all the previous assumptions we've made. Encourage your designers and engineers to talk openly about trade-offs that impact the user experience design. And as each screen or feature gets developed, jot down a few assumptions we made to get where we landed that we want to validate, and then work those into the testing plan. And then as you're getting close to your first release, it's critical to make time for polish by implementing a feature phase and focusing a feature freeze and focusing everyone's attention to cleanup and small details that will make the product more usable in the last few weeks. If your product owner is your first user and your subject matter expert is the second, the product designer should be the third. They should be able to see their designs in action and look for spots where design flourishes or improved interaction patterns will make an impact. In my experience, the 80-20 rule really applies here. You can get 80% of the value of a 2 or 3 week polish phase with 20% of the effort. Last but not least, I want to cover how product owners can help to minimize complexity so the team can continue to iterate on the software over time. The first is pretty simple. Be an advocate for simplicity. Simple solutions are the quickest to build, easiest to change, and often the easiest for users to understand. By advocating for the simplest solutions to users' highest priority problems, you're driving the team toward creating the most valuable product for your customers. The next is to anticipate exceptions. I love to say that computers are really nothing more than big, dumb math boxes, and all they understand are rules based on data and logic. And wherever there are rules, there are going to be exceptions, and exceptions contribute disproportionately to complexity. Support your team by anticipating those exceptions so they can be properly accounted for in the initial implementation versus having to be tacked on later when they're uncovered during QA. Next, we don't expect product owners to be as technical as our engineers, but successful product owners have a good understanding of the full software system and how different components interact with each other. By becoming an expert, not just in what the software does, but how the software works, you'll be better able to support the team in thinking through how future features can be integrated into the existing system. Finally, as a product owner, you can help to promote an investment mindset. When deadlines are looming, it can be easy to fall into the build trap, focusing on getting as many features as possible working as quickly as possible. Good software design requires a more strategic approach where you invest time in fixing problems as they arrive, refactoring previous work, and cleaning up tech debt. This investment of resources can sometimes be a tough thing to advocate for, but it keeps the code base clean and easy to work with and makes it much easier to react to what you learn after launch. Because that's where all this is leading, launching your software to real users so you can see where you went wrong and start making improvements. I know that was a lot to cover in a pretty short time frame, but I hope this has given you a good baseline understanding of how to approach, plan, scope, and deliver a successful and effective MVP. And if your organization has already built a software product or you're actively working on one, all of these same principles and recommendations can be integrated into your current process, and I guarantee it will lead to better outcomes for both your organization and your end users. Thanks again so much for joining us today. We've got some time now for questions, so I'm going to turn it back over to Addison, who will be leading the Q&A portion of this webinar. And as a reminder, if you have any questions, you can drop them in the box.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Claire. We'll give folks just a second to keep dropping some questions in here, but a few that came in during the webinar. First is, how do you handle stakeholders who are hesitant to test assumptions, maybe hesitant to embracing the failure of their ideas?
Sorry, can you repeat the question? I was jotting down a note.
Sure. How do you handle stakeholders who are hesitant to test assumptions?
That's a great question. So one of the books that we're going to share afterward is Continuous Discovery Habits by Teresa Torres. And she talks a lot about how this acknowledgement that we don't know everything can cause a lot of doubt. You know, people can sort of feel paralyzed by doubt. And so I think what you would want to do is try to encourage stakeholders to find that sweet spot between I'm feeling so much doubt that I don't know where to move forward, and I'm so confident in my assumptions, or I'm so confident that I know what's right, that I'm not willing to see what users might be interested in, or hear firsthand how people are approaching this problem. So I think I would say you want to try to find that sweet spot in the middle. And then this is maybe a little bit of a cop out, but I think that this notion that most digital products fail, like this is not an original Claire thought. I think this is pretty well understood in our industry. And so I think, if you're working with a stakeholder who just has his or her own ideas and wants those to be implemented, I think coming to the table and making a strong case for why that's not likely going to lead to a successful outcome will help hopefully change their mind.
Awesome. Next question up is, how is the OKR framework used when the product does not yet exist?
That's a great question. So one thing that can be tricky is figuring out how to establish a baseline. So one thing that we've done, we actually did this with a client we're working on right now. They helped us come up with a baseline by observing users using basically a competitor's tool. So they were looking for things like, how long does it take them to complete documentation, or how often do they have to go back and make changes? And so having some way to measure what problems users are facing with whatever current tool or process they're using is a good way to start there. And I think that a lot of this is kind of grounded in that idea of like, we're looking at users who are trying to do a thing and they have an existing, they're doing that somehow now. It's just not working for them. So I think kind of trying to ground that in however users are accomplishing this now is a good way to think about it.
Great. Next one that was sent in here, in your experience, how often has a client's market research perhaps clashed with your findings about users in the discovery phase? And then a follow-up question, how has that influenced prototyping and prioritization of user problems?
That is a really good question. I find that when clients come to us who have done market research, I find that is always helpful. We like to think of the discovery phase, especially that exploratory research, as like there's no such thing as too much information. So we may get outputs from a customer's market research, and we may find maybe we're seeing something that's a little bit different. But all of that is going to be super helpful for background information. And, I think just like anything, thinking of this as sort of an iterative of like evolving of our understanding. So maybe they did this market research and they've come to these conclusions. Now we're looking in discovery phase. It's not like things from market research were wrong. It's just now we have a better understanding of these things based on more information.
Great. And time for one last question here. This one's about tooling. What's your go-to method for software tools, maybe for jotting down and organizing on the job, and ways to be able to prioritize things?
Do you know if this person meant like my personal tasking?
Yeah, your go-to method or software tool that you prefer to use or might recommend for folks to try out.
Yeah, sure. So this is going to be, I'll answer this in two ways. A lot of our project and product managers at Vigit get a lot of value out of using Notion to keep information organized. And I personally love Notion as a tool for that sort of mid-level planning for products. That's like sort of somewhere between your user story map, which is pretty high level, and then like these sort of tasks for like tickets that are tasks for engineers. So love Notion. I will say though that effective software product teams have a delivery manager who is pretty much dedicated to the team and can react on the fly when things come up. So rather than thinking like we're in this stand up and 3 people said they needed something, what tool do we use to make sure that they get what they need? I would think about it instead as like, do we have a person whose job it is to make sure that they get what they need? And I just use a sheet of paper. Like I'm pretty old school, but I'll have a sheet of paper where I'll write those things down. And then like, I just know that those 3 people are blocked until I get them that information. So it doesn't have to live in a system. It just has to live in my head, which doesn't hold that much information. So it lives on my sheet of paper.
Sweet. Well, it looks like that is all the questions that we have time for today. But want to thank everyone again for joining us and sharing your questions. If you have any additional questions or comments or just want to get in touch, please feel free to shoot myself or Claire an email. We've got our info up on the screen now. And I believe that's all that we have for folks today. So you can keep an eye for an email with a recording of this webinar, as well as some of the resources that Claire has mentioned throughout the presentation and a PDF of the slides we shared today. Thanks everyone for joining and take care.
Thanks so much. Have a great day, everybody.